Hello everyone, I'm Jim Rambo, Senior Technical Trainer with the Google Search Appliance. Now we're going to talk about searching database data with the Google Search Appliance. The first thing that comes up is a question typically customers will ask, about 90% of customers will ask, can I crawl and index my database data? And the answer is yes, you can. About 50% of customers do crawl and index database data, but there may be a better solution for what you're trying to accomplish. Database data is typically very transactional. It changes very rapidly, and so indexing it may not be the best approach because by the time you index it may be out of date. And we'll talk about when you would want to use the different options. There are a couple options on the box for crawling the database data and indexing it. There's one option for using a one-box module. So we'll talk about these different options and when to use each of them. Then we'll go through and show you how to deploy the off-board connector. We mentioned that database data is typically highly transactional, meaning it changes all the time. That's the nature of a database. It's got a lot of data, and the database does build up its own index of row data. So if you have an example like the table shown below here, you've got the name, the address, the city, the state. If the only data in your database or in the tables that you're interested in is row data, meaning it's stored directly in the database and you can index it using database indexes, then search may not be the best alternative. It might be better to just go ahead and search the data in the database using its own database query tool. If, however, you have documents stored in the database data along with your record data, such as the example here shown below, where we have a URL to a document inside of the database. A lot of times content management systems are built up this way. They store documents externally outside of the database in a web server. This is a good alternative for the search appliance because those documents are very text heavy. It might be a CRM system where you're storing your contracts. It might be a ticket support system. And in the case of the support system, the documents may be stored as part of the record data in a database as a blob field, okay, a very large binary object, or it might be a very large text field. Sometimes those fields aren't easy to index inside of a database, so that's another good example where you would use the search appliance. Now let's look at our options that are available with the search appliance. We have three options. One is called the OnBoard crawler. This is a one-page setup wizard on the GSA. All the software is on the box, and all you have to do is configure the one-page setup. The caveat with database records is that each record counts as one hit on your license. These can consume your license quickly, so you want to consider which records you want to include. The OnBoard crawler's advantage is that it has easy setup. It supports most databases, such as MySQL. The downside is that it doesn't provide real-time updates. You have to manually go in and synchronize with the database or write a screen scraping tool, which we'll show you later. And the disadvantage is it doesn't support security either. So no automated updates, no security, and it counts as one hit against your license. The off-board connector is more robust. It handles security. It will handle auto updates. The downside is that the connector still requires one hit against your license for each record. The one-box module, there's no license hit. It doesn't go through and index those documents and determine their relevance. It only displays the one-box results at the top of the page. On a search appliance, here's you go to Crawl and Index, Databases. Here's where you find the OnBoard crawler configuration page. You give it a source name. It can be anything. You choose which database type you want to crawl. You identify the host name that the server's on, the port number, and give it the database name that you want to crawl. And here's the user credentials for the crawler. And then you can select star from, and then whatever SQL statement you want to use to fetch the records and index them. Now, I won't go into the details of the rest of the configuration here because the OnBoard crawler is something you typically aren't going to use unless you have no security involved and you want a quick and easy setup into one of the 5 supported databases is available to you, and you'll need to perform manual updates. I'll show you how that's done later. Let's focus in on the off-board connector. This is where we're going to spend our energy in this session. It additionally handles the JDBC drivers, automated updates, security. It'll perform, the GSA will perform the authentication, and the authorization can get done inside of the database, but we just don't support database authentication just yet. And we don't support ACLs and e-index, so the access control lists that will determine which users have access to which records, that'll be maintained inside of the database. It won't be maintained inside of the GSA, so you may notice a performance degradation at serve time. Okay, now let's take a look at what happens with simple record data. Here's an example. If this is our table on the top right here, top left, then we've got a first name, a last name, city, and zip fields, but no document data. So this is not, we're not dealing with a document stored in a web server, we're not dealing with a blob or a clob stored in the database. What happens is the GSA will index this data, and as it indexes it, it will build up an HTML document representation of the field names and the field values shown down here in the bottom right. When a user runs a search request, here's what they'll see. The document data will be entered using a content feed, and it will only be row data. The title of the snippet will be manually created for you, and the snippet that's included will also be manually created as a list of the row names and the row values. You can change this using the style sheet that's available in the database. If a user clicks on this link, this is not a link out to a document on a web server, it's only record data inside the database. So that link, it's going to by default point to the cached version of that HTML document on the search appliance, because we don't have a way of sending a real-time request from a browser to a database directly. Now, documents that will be stored on a web server, like in a content management system, maybe it's a homegrown solution and it's one of our connectors doesn't support it, but there's a database storing the metadata for the records. I'll go here. Here, in this case, the database will store the row data, like city, name, address, product, and then the web server may contain the web documents that describe the product. And these may be HTML documents, might be PDFs, might be PowerPoints, might be Word documents. It doesn't matter as long as we have a link to a web server and the document, then the database connector can crawl that content. Here's what it looks like inside of the search, when we think about it inside the search appliance and the index. Again, we'll have the record data and its values, and now there'll be an additional field that we identify with either the blob or a URL link to the document. When a user runs a search, the title and its link will point to the document on the web server, and the snippet will also contain a snippet from the text in the document. So you can search for these values in the row data, or you can search for the text inside the document. Before we configure the connector, let's take a look at our database data and our database server to get comfortable with it. Here I've set up a database, a MySQL database on the Manila server, port 3306, and there's a user called demo that has read permission on all of the database data. The database I'm going to work with is called healthcare. I select OK in my browser. I can see the list of tables in the database. I can run a SQL select statement to view my record data. Here I'm going to look at the carrier table. I have 3 records. Here's the key field, the primary key field that'll be used. I have name data, address, city, state, and over to the right I have some more fields, and this field called sign up, where there's a URL to a document for each record of data on a web server. So again, if this were my CRM system and these were maybe contracts, I would have these links, and if I specify this field, the crawler will send a request out to that web server and fetch the document and index it. On the web server, this is what the documents look like. I have one document that has crutches in the text. I'm just using simple text fields. I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible. The first medical HTML document has bandage, and the third document has a keyword in there for searching aspirin. To download the off-board connector software, you need to go log into your support portal account at support.google.com/enterprise or google.com/enterprise/portal. Log into your account, go to Resources, and then toward the bottom where you'll find Search Appliance. It depends on how many products you have in here. Here's the Search Appliance Connector software. And here's where you can get the latest releases. 2.84 is the latest, and here's the release notes for it. I've downloaded the connector software on a user workstation. You can deploy it on Windows or Linux. And I run the installer. This deploys in seconds. I go through some of the standard configuration type screens here. I accept the terms of the conditions of the license. I'm going to install one type of connector. I'll choose the database. Here I'll select a jar file for my driver. I'm using a MySQL database, so I have to download the MySQL database jar file. The connector deploys as an Apache Tomcat application on this Windows workstation, so I'm going to give it a name for the Windows service, the port number it's going to listen on, and the IP address of my GSA. I'll choose the JRE file that I want to use. I'll choose the install folder, which is just the default, and the shortcut folder. Last thing I do is I want to register a connector manager inside of the search appliance that I can configure. So I'm going to define credentials to the GSA and which connector manager name I'm going to install this on. That's it. I've installed the connector. It's listening on a Tomcat Apache application here. Under the All Programs, this is the default location for the shortcut. I can start the service, stop it. I can test its connectivity, which is a good idea. Make sure it's listening and can talk to the search appliance. And I can also uninstall it from there. One last thing that's useful to look at is it's a Windows service, but it's started up, and here's the name, database 1 that I gave it, and it started up manually. So if you wanted to automatically restart if the server goes down, then you'll have to change this setting. On the search appliance, I'm ready to configure the connector. I go to the connector manager that I just deployed, select Add a new connector, and it's going to automatically select database type. I'll just name it MyDB3. And I get the configuration page. Here you specify the name of the user that has read permissions to crawl the content, the JDBC connection URL. In this case, it's going to be the location of on your server, and specifying the type of database. You can check documentation for the kind of entries you have to put here. The database name is healthcare. This is where the connector is installed. user10.learngsa.com. That's this Windows workstation back here that I just installed the connector on. The JDBC driver class name, and for your type of database, you'll have to look in the documentation for this. Now I'm going to select all records from my carrier table. This is the SQL statement you use to crawl the content. You can specify, you can be selective as to which fields you crawl, which tables you get. You can use anything except nested joins in here. And here's where you specify the key name, the name of the primary key field, which in this case was carrier ID. Down here you can specify if there's a document coming along with the record data. I'm going to leave this blank for now and go ahead and crawl the content. Now, since I'm using a a content feed. I'm only getting record data, so I'm going to be using a content type feed. And a content type feed requires that you have Google connector colon in the follow and crawl patterns. If I hadn't put this in ahead of time, then the feed would have failed. Here is the status of our feed down here. Notice that it's an incremental type. That's a content feed type. And that it's in progress. We have 3 URLs that we've found, 3 documents. Let's go to status and reports. We'll check the crawl diagnostics to see what the status is on the feed. Notice because it's a content feed, here's the type, here's the URL pattern you're going to get: Google connector, the name of the connector, and localhost. And each of the document IDs will be it's a URL encoded and concatenation of the primary key field values. So it's not going to be very readable here. If you go to the cache link, if the index is finished, you won't get this message, but once the indexing is complete, we'll see the HTML generated page for the record data. Let's take another look at the cached link. Now it's been indexed. Notice that we have our row data. This is the HTML document that was generated as a wrapper around the field names and values. We even have the URL of the document that's on the web server, but we didn't fetch the document because we didn't configure it that way in the connector. We'll search for the city of New Haven, and let's go to the search page. We'll run a search for New Haven, and here's the document. Now, notice that the snippet, it's a combination of the field names and values. The link goes to what? The cached version of the document on the GSA, because we couldn't insert a JDBC lookup here. It's just not available inside of a browser. If we run a search for bandage or aspirin, we don't get any search results. The reason being that the documents themselves were not fetched and indexed, so that content's not available inside for searching. Now let's change things up, and we'll just install, we want to crawl the content, the documents, and index them as well, the text inside of the web documents. So what we're going to do is, rather than removing our connector and reconfiguring, we're just going to add another connector here. So on Connector Manager 2, we'll add a new connector. And on here, I'll just name it MyDB4. We'll go through the same configuration as before. The only thing that's different now is down at the bottom, we need to choose where we're going to get that document URL from. Is it going to be, or is the document a blob, or is it a URL, and is the URL one field, or is it an ID field with a base URL field? In this case, it's just going to be the name of that that field in the database, and that changes everything. Okay, the connector started, but if we go to our feeds page, we're going to see that the feed failed. We're going to click on this fail. And why? Because we didn't put the URL patterns of the documents on the web server to be in the follow and crawl patterns. So we have to add that. And we'll do that now. Just remove a comment on it. We'll have to reset the connector. So I'll reset connector 4. Go back to feeds and check the status. Now it's in progress. Now notice that the status on the feed has been completed. Notice this time that it's a metadata and URL feed. So the URLs in the index will be different. They'll be the actual web documents. And the row data from the database will be just added as metadata. So we'll drill down. Now when the content's available under URL direct, this is the directory on the web server. Here are our 3 documents that have been crawled and indexed along with their database metadata. Click on the cached version of the document. You'll see here's that text that we had seen before. Now let's go back and run a search. Run a search for, say, aspirin. Here's our document that's been crawled and fetched. Notice that now, and this came from our database connector, notice that we have a link now that goes right out to the document on the Athens web server. The snippet has been generated by default, has been generated from the text in the document, and the link here is also pointing to it. If we go to the cached version, it's the same thing. It's the document. Now, where did our database data go? The metadata is inside the index. It's just not being displayed in the search results. To display it in search results, we go back and either edit or create another front end. And under the DB front end that I've already created, I've set the show meta tags in the style sheet to true right here. And now if I reference that front end, and if I add get fields equals star to get all the metadata fields, the metadata is now displayed. Here's what the row data looks like for my metadata and URL feed. If I search for New Haven, which will be is also record data. Now, see, here's the record from the database using my first content feed, and here's the record, the document in my second feed using the metadata and URL feed. Notice that the records, the metadata is a little bit different. Some final notes to talk about databases. If you're going to modify, if you want to modify the style sheet for serving results, here's where you can do that in the configuration page. You can also enter in a last modified date field, because remember, we're getting data from a database table, and that the last modified date information can be anywhere inside of that table. So you want to make sure you identify the field for it. This will give you your document date in the index. And you can also specify the document title field. You can, if you have security set up, then you can build, what you'll have to do is build essentially an ACL table. An ACL table is a concatenation of each of the primary key fields that uniquely identifies each record in the database, and then a list of users and groups that have permission to that document. Then what you do is, on the configuration page of the connector, you specify under the auth-z query, you'll specify a select statement of a concat, and for more information on this, you can check your documentation. Since the connector runs as a Tomcat app, you can go to your log4j logging properties file to find logs if you need to troubleshoot the connector. Remember, I mentioned that if you use the OnBoard database crawler under databases, when you've configured your database, it'll show up and you'll see a sync button. You'll have to manually synchronize each time you want to do a refetch of the content from the database. This is one of the downsides to the OnBoard crawler. You could write a screen scraping script that can simulate pressing this button, and this is code that hasn't changed in years, so screen scraping should work for you. So just in summary, we've described the features and benefits of database search, how to decide when to use the OnBoard crawler, the offboard connector, or a one-box module, and then how to deploy the offboard connector. For more details, consult our online documentation.